In this chapter, we're largely talking about the economic change that comes primarily through the transportation infrastructure. And most notably, after the Civil War, that's all going to be about the railroads. It's somewhat crazy how excited and involved economic historians get about railroads. I mean, I get the excitement after, you know, all these decades of US economic history where we're talking about canals and covered wagons. I mean, yawn, now you get a big old fast train that's going to get people really excited. And again, I'm from the Midwest, so as a Midwesterner, which is all train centric, I mean, there's nothing more exciting than talking about trains. Um, with that all said, um, this chapter is pretty important for understanding the post-Civil War period. And the chapter actually starts out with a really good summary of the four questions that get asked by economic historians about this time period and the railroads. Let me go to the book chapter just so we kind of get these, so you can kind of see these easily. And it would be the first question would be, are the railroads being built ahead of the development, or is the development occurring and then the railroads linking them? So that would be important because that's going to give us a pretty good idea about the patterns of settlement. The second question is, how are these railroads getting their capital? We know that this is an important question because we'd already had sort of the failed history from the canal region, from the building of the canals. So that's going to influence what's going on. And it's also going to be an excellent test for how strong the banking system and capital markets are in the system, in the country. The third question would be, what role did the federal and state government have in the railroads, both in terms of the speed of their development, but also where they're being placed? And then we'd also want to look at the regulatory structure, especially given the fact that for these railroads, this is becoming a pretty early national industry. And then finally, the fourth question is, how is it helping the development of the economy as a whole? Are we seeing that there are dramatic increases in productivity or any other significant changes in the economy that wouldn't have been possible had we not had a railroad? And this just kind of tells us a little bit more about the um, uh, just again the general development of an economy and what it takes to build things. The excitement pretty easy early on with the railroads turns to the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Transcontinental Railroad, um, it shows a, okay, I can see, jeez. I mean, it is the case that I am looking at these slides after they were created, but I think I'm just realizing how incredibly bad they are. Okay, well, let's build it right here. Um, and then let's build the, so what we can see here is that in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, this is done with, this is done during the Civil War, it's decided that, we're going to build this railway. And we get this with the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, with the Union Pacific Railroad going from Council Bluffs, Iowa, which basically is Omaha, going from Omaha to the west. And then the Central Pacific Railroad is going to go from Sacramento, and it's going to go east. And the original idea was that the Central Pacific is going to go only out to the Nevada border, and the Union Pacific would stop at the Nevada border. But even as you're seeing from this picture here from the Union Pacific, which is a railroad that still exists to this day, what you see from this site here is that it gives you an idea not only of their progress over time, but then the stopping point here would be May 9th, 1869 at Promontory Point, with the Central Pacific going basically again from Sacramento out to here. So about 4 years to build this railroad. The only ways you were going from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States before this were pretty difficult. You could, the one obvious way would be is you could take a wagon train. And that wagon train, it could operate all 4 seasons of the year, except you had challenges. You had really bad weather in the winter. It was really dry and some pretty bad storms even in the summer. And you still had attacks from Native Americans all year round. The estimate is that if you're going to be taking a wagon, it's going to be it's going to be about, it's going to be at least 2 months, 3 months, something like that. You can get, you could cross at Panama, so you could take a ship to Panama from the East Coast. Then you would take like a little train or like a mule ride to the other side of Panama, and then continue the journey by boat, and that would take it about 6 to 8 weeks. Or you could go around South America, and South America is going to be it's going to be what, about 4 months or so. So everything, we didn't really have a good connection is really what I'm trying to say. The options we had were pretty bad. Wagon, going across Panama, or going around South America. And again, in this northern idea that especially becomes important after the Civil War, how are you going to get the things that are being grown on the frontier back to the East Coast? Again, you're using canals, you're using river travel as much as you can, but you really need this railroad. And the only way that they're told that they can do this, that they can build this railroad, is with the government providing some level of support, like they did for the building of the canals. It's during the Pierce administration, President Pierce, when Congress does a study in 1853, and they determined that it is possible, it's feasible to build a railroad to the West Coast. And they asked government engineers to go out and figure out what the best routes would be. Everyone was trying to debate with the routes that they had. Everyone wanted to be the terminus. basically the gateway to the West, everyone along the Mississippi River. What we end up with is, again, the terminus being Omaha, which would be not along the Mississippi River, but at least would be a point where the Union Pacific Railroad had its headquarters. And when the routes were being decided, the routes were being decided in 1862, and by that point we're already in the Civil War, so the northern government's not going to have any of the routes going through the South or starting at the South. And they decided, since it was being built starting in Omaha, then it's going to follow basically the North Platte River, which becomes a pretty important river um, outside of Omaha. And what the government does is it first gives it starts the Union Pacific Railroad itself, gives it a charter of incorporation. It establishes itself at the eastern terminus, which would be Omaha on the North Platte River. And again, the idea is that it's going to build out all the way to the Nevada border. Then the Central Pacific Railroad is created in California in 1861, so just a year before the Pacific Railway Act was passed. And again, it's going to go from Sacramento to the Nevada border. Both of these companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, are being given U.S. government assistance. The assistance was that they were going to get a loan amount for each mile that they build, and that they were going to get public land on either side of the rail that they're building. And the idea was that the loans are going to be secured. The security for the loans is going to be the land that they're being given. And the idea is that, the railroad doesn't want to hold on to the land. It's going to want to sell the land and then use those proceeds to help pay for things. The realization pretty quickly on, and so that's in 1862. The rail isn't being built until 1865, a year before construction starts. The realization is that there wasn't enough private money coming in to make this work. The government subsidy wasn't enough to do it without this private money. So they had to increase the amount of the public subsidy. And so they doubled the amount of land that they would get. And what they would do as well is they would be able to sell the loans. The loans could be marketed to the private sector, and the public would kind of back up, serve as security if the loan failed. And additionally, the Central Pacific Railroad was allowed to go further into Utah. So the Nevada border is right here, and this would be about 150 to 200 miles that they're allowed to go further east. The idea or the hope was that you're going to build this railroad. You're going to build the railroads as fast as possible. In the one sense, you've got a race. You've got a race between the Union Pacific right here and the Central Pacific. Well, let's get theirs. Now, this is also just a good map too. We can just kind of look at it from here. But basically, you can see again that they're going about 150 miles beyond and crossing over the rest of the way here. So you go to Union Pacific here. It's building 1,086 miles, and then the Central Pacific is going over much, much tougher terrain, and it lays 689 miles. Each of the railroads has different kinds of workers. The Union Pacific is using mostly the Irish and former soldiers from the Civil War. The Central Pacific famously is using Chinese immigrants to go through the mountains. And again, by 1869, the railroad is finished. President Grant sends a telegraph that lays that puts in the golden spike with the railroad. You get this kind of famous picture here, which the book doesn't have, but I'm pretty certain if we look here, we'll see. Oh, look at that. We can see what the golden spike looks like. Leland Stanford, that would be the Stanford that gets us Stanford University. And there's one of you in the class that's going to Stanford. So look at that. That's how he made his money, although you probably already knew that. Anyway, no, I'm just scrolling down here because I want to get to this famous picture here, which would be the point where the two trains are meeting, and you've got the laying of the last spike at Promontory Point. I guess here you got these kind of pictures here, at least of what the Central Pacific Railroad would look like. It gives you an idea of the incredibly tough terrain that they're dealing with. So the government help, again, is coming from the grant of the lands and the loans provided for each mile, with then that subsidy increased in 1864 after there wasn't enough private money coming in. Once the rail is completed, it does two things. So the one thing it does is it stops a great deal of movement by wagon, at least for goods and especially for the mail. There was in the lead up to the finishing of the Transcontinental Railroad, there was the Pony Express, for instance, that operated between 1860 and 1861. This was a really the Pony Express is an incredibly interesting history if you're into this kind of thing. It operates the nearly 2,000 miles, but it gets from essentially it gets from I think it starts in around the same point, somewhere in Nebraska or maybe Missouri, and it gets all the way to California and the far west coast. And it does that in 10 days. And so what was happening is that the riders would basically switch horses every 75 to 100 miles, and the horses would get a break every 10 miles. And to send about a half ounce of mail was the equivalent of $200 today. It was $5 at the time. And the primary stuff that was moving through the Pony Express was letters, newspapers, and other kind of government correspondence. The building of the Transcontinental Railroad meant that you didn't have to have this anymore. And additionally, with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, you also have the Transcontinental Railroad. In addition to that, before that railroad's even being built, you've got the expansion of the telegraph line. And the telegraph line, which we get installed by the end of 1861, that's enough too to kind of keep the country together in terms of communication. With the Transcontinental Railroad, and the telegraph lines, you're not seeing much more going on by wagon. About the only example we really have of anything meaningful happening by um, by wagon or even by what we would call hand cart would be the Mormons that are basically hoofing it from the old um, well, basically from near Omaha, and they're basically walking about 1,000 miles all the way to Salt Lake City. And that's a pretty rough walk overall. What you also get, though, interestingly enough, is that with the building of the railroad, we can now, with that generally built, we can now then create the rest of the rail system around this one line. Chicago becomes quite central in this discussion, as does St. Louis, Kansas City, Minneapolis, and Denver. All of those cities I just listed remain important rails stops to this day. Chicago is the largest rail location in the United States today, followed pretty closely by Milwaukee, where I'm from originally. Almost everyone in my family works for the railroad, so I guess we don't change. If we want to look at this, there's a really interesting map here. Let's go to the textbook here. You can see this right here. So this is the current railroad structure that we have right now. Interestingly, as I'm making this lecture on July 18th, just yesterday, July 17th, the Union Pacific, the same Union Pacific we were talking about with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, is trying to buy the Norfolk Southern Railroad, bringing back an entirely East Coast to West Coast railroad. How exciting would that be? So, right, so we've got the Union Pacific here, and the Union Pacific basically doesn't really change very much from Omaha. It doesn't go much farther east. Got some routes that take you to Chicago, but not very much more. But the Norfolk Southern, right here, that would allow them to capture a great deal of the southern United States today and give them a truly national railroad again. Um, this map is actually outdated. Yeah, this map is outdated because the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe doesn't exist anymore. It got bought out by the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And the Illinois Central Gulf doesn't exist anymore, nor does the Southern Pacific Railroad anymore. So let's just look at a better map here. These are called Class 1 railroads. Let's look at this in two ways here. That's good to see. This one's a pretty good map here. I'm just looking at this for the first time. I shouldn't say it's a good map, but I know it. Anyway, this would be pretty good, right? So you've got your Transcontinental Railroad here. And then as you can see, you're building up the rest of this infrastructure. And notice, most of this is in the north. You're building up the infrastructure, and now you've got your clear way all the way out to San Francisco. So this is 1870. Again, where they're using kind of the hub and spoke model that we use for airlines today. Again, key cities being St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis, and even to some extent Milwaukee. Then we're going to look at the current day map. Let's just take it in 2020. Yeah, it's good enough. I am a human. Yeah. So the Burlington North, so again, this would be even from 2020, it's not a perfect description here, but again, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the BREO line here, so that's owned by Warren Buffett today. The Union Pacific would be our dark blue. It's a pretty extensive part of the railroad. Again, the Union Pacific is wanting to buy the Norfolk Southern, the light blue. So the light blue would then be combined with the dark blue. And then we got the Canadian Pacific, which is obviously not really part of our discussion. The Canadian Pacific is not that you care, but that would be where most of my family works, for the Canadian Pacific. And then we've got the Canadian National, the green line here. That's important because that's actually where a lot of car production goes, on the Canadian National. And then we've got the East Coast Railroad, the CSX. And CSX covers, as you can see, a great deal of the East Coast. These are the railroads we have today. Same underlying structure though, right? You've got your hub cities, again, like you're at Chicago, you're St. Louis. This is Galesburg, Illinois, kind of a hidden hub for the Burlington Northern Railroad. Again, look at that, Minneapolis. Minneapolis, you've got the Union Pacific going off from the Canadian Pacific, going off from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, all happening at Minneapolis. And again, you got another hub here. That would be our Omaha. And what's happening here? You've got port traffic coming into LA, and then things being spread out. You've got port traffic here coming from Baltimore, and then things getting spread out. Okay. A lot of this work is also done by my favorite economist. My favorite economist is Arthur Burns. Not only was he an excellent economic historian, he was also a quite influential monetarist who at one time was the president of the American Economics Association, and he was also he also ran the research department at the St. Louis Federal Reserve. His wife was a historian of colonial history, the colonial history in the United States. But what the Nobel laureate Kuznets, so Kuznets invented the modern GDP statistic, the C plus I plus G plus NX. Kuznets and Arthur Burns both argued that the railroad brought on rapid industrialization. But then what happened is that after a certain point in time, after that rapid industrial expansion, that the expansion slowed down. And so what you see here is that you've got the rapid expansion here in terms of going from just 31,000 miles in 1860 to, by the turn of the 20th century, having almost a fifth of a million miles, 207,000 miles of rail track. It's a lot of rail track, right? And you can see this here is that you have in the beginning very large increases that then slow down in terms of that investment. Now, why is that, right? Part of that would come from the fact that the best rail had already been laid, connecting the big cities and whatnot, and that you would have connected the factories and the types of businesses that needed to be connected. But what we also see is that one of the reasons why we see this slowdown in the building out of the railroads is that it also depends on the capital markets. And what we see is that we actually have three different eras of railroad construction between 1860 and 1920. It's between 1868 and 1873, 1879 and 1883, and then 1886 to 1892. Each of those eras of railroad construction end because of a financial crisis. And that's because railroads depend a great deal on borrowed money. And basically, when you have a financial crisis, it becomes impossible to borrow money, which would then mean you can't really build the railroad. Throughout the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, a huge amount of capital investment in the United States is all centered around the railroad. As much as 20% in the 1870s, 15% of capital formation in the 1880s, and then under 10% in all the rest of the decades for each decade, all the way out through 1920. At its peak, you've got 5% of the total labor force all devoted to the railroads. 1 in 20. 1 in 20 workers were somehow involved in the railroads by 1920, its peak. We are, in part, right, as you would expect, that as the North is industrializing further and further, it's not surprising that you're also going to have significant labor, significant capital, significant resources all devoted to the railroads. But the question still comes down to, when we look at the overall economy and we see the kind of increases that we have, the question is the railroad itself creating the economic growth in the United States in the closing decades of the 19th century? The theory used to be, yes, that it was because of the railroads that we got gains in productivity and that the economy could grow even more. But it turns out that part of that was just temporary, that the increases in productivity couldn't be expected to always happen. And that also, though, what we see is that the railroads, even if they weren't contributing to the greater productivity in the United States, what they were was a symbol for this new country that was being built. And, that symbol was one of speed, was one of power. Okay, I'm going to pause here. So, yeah, even if it doesn't increase the productivity in the United States, it is that symbol of progress, and you kind of need that for the building up of the economy after the Civil War. It becomes important for that, at least as a symbol. Okay, so let's go to the question here. Again, with question number 1, again, that economic historians of the United States typically ask. So question number 1 is, was this investment in the railroad, especially the transcontinental railroad, is this being built ahead of demand, in anticipation of demand, or are you building this railroad because you've got so many people that are already out on the West Coast? Sorry, that was my wife calling. But so we have 7 Class 1 railroads right now in the United States. So I know this is an interruption for what I was just saying, but when my wife was calling, I was also looking at Wikipedia here. So we have 7 Class 1 railroads here in North America. 2 of them Canadian, that would be the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Santa Fe Railroad. And then the rest are American, with Amtrak being one of them, then the others being freight. Look at this. This is really cool. Well, cool. Look at all the failed or merged Class 1 railroads. That's a lot. These are all failed or merged Class 1 railroads. Not very many anymore. Great consolidation within this industry, meaning that today the way that they're able to continue to operate is by basically having an oligopolistic structure. Now that's important because even if we go back to the building of this infrastructure, it still has a great deal of lack of competition to be able to charge prices that can support what you're trying to do. And so if we look at the map for today, again, you see the same kind of thing. Chicago really being the center, the primary hub for the entire Class 1 railroad system. And again, you've got the Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe, which the Burlington Northern, Santa Fe, and Union Pacific, which basically own the West Coast. And then the Norfolk Southern and the CSX, which basically own the East Coast. And the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National just do north-south to the northern states like Wisconsin and Minnesota and parts of New York and Michigan. Okay, back to our question here. Were the railroads built ahead of demand, or were people already there and the railroads just kind of built onto that? The Schumpeter theory, which comes out from Joseph Schumpeter, the pretty well-known economist in the early 1900s, his theory was that the railroads were built ahead of demand. And so that basically the idea that the railroad was there would bring the people out there. So because of this, because of Schumpeter's belief that the railroad was built ahead of demand, that would then mean that the government subsidy was absolutely necessary to build the railroad. And I guess, in some sense, that would make sense because if you built the railroad ahead of demand, then you wouldn't have a great deal of volume of either passengers or freight. So you would need that subsidy in order to be able to, pay all the bills, basically. One of the interesting things, though, that we see is that if the railroad wasn't built yet in an area, that basically there would be rumors, there'd be theories within a region about a railroad perhaps coming soon. And so there was an extent to which there was anticipatory settlement, where people would move into the region expecting, buying the land cheaper or getting their farm started, and then, just a few years later, the railroad hopefully coming. The question though still remains, for both Schumpeter and this other theory that comes from Albert Fischlow, and talking about whether we're building ahead of demand or not. That work starts to get done by Robert Fogel, again, a pretty well-known economic historian, and Lloyd Mercer. And what they generally found was that for the railroads, they didn't make a lot of money at moving either freight or people. And you really did need this government subsidy as sort of a reflection of the positive externalities that are generated by having a railroad. And that the general theory is that while some railroads were built because of settlement already existing, that the majority, or well, at least quite a few railroads were built ahead of demand, and that those ones absolutely needed the government subsidies, the significant government subsidies. From the railroad's perspective, we had a history to rely on to see how the government would react. the government had already given significant money, especially at the state level, to the building of canals. And, the railroad, the government didn't have a ton of money sitting around like they did in the 1830s, especially at the state level, just given that they had just finished the Civil War and the national debt at the end of 1860. Actually, let's just look at this here. Let's just look at 1865. What, 2.6 billion, I guess? That's what the pig tells us here. $2.6 billion. That's a lot of money. Especially given that in the lead up to the Civil War, it was only 65 million, right? So they didn't have a lot of money, the government. So it couldn't do what it had done for the canals. And so it had to basically provide its money either with tax exemptions or by just giving land, rather than just giving money directly. And it didn't even, at the end of the day, at the end of the building of the railroads, the the government only gave land to the railroads until 1871, because at that point the public got really mad about all this land being given to the railroads for free. And so by that point, the railroads had received about 131 million acres, which is a lot. That's about 9% of what was in the public domain, 9% of the land that was in the public domain. In return for providing that land subsidy, the government actually got a really sweet deal, because what the government got is it got either free of charge or very, very, very low priced transportation of the US mail, of US government troops, and of other US government property. And it got cheap enough rates that at the end of the day, the government made out on that deal. What was the theory here? What was the calculation? That the government saved about $500 million in what they would have paid for passengers and freight. And that was about, that was several times the value of the land that they gave, which, adjusting for inflation, it might be a wash, but still, the government got to enjoy that for a longer period of time. What the railroads did do that was pretty notable. Right here, we got the idea of the land grants. So I guess that's just to quickly review here. In terms of the answer to this question, for the most part, the railroads were built as a response to the settlement patterns that existed, and only with a few railroads were the railroads truly built ahead of demand. So for the most part, because of the level of investment and risk that was required, the railroads were only built where settlements were already established, not in this conjecture of where we think settlements might end up. Okay, so that's the first part. We already talked about this, the distribution of the land, so I'm going to skip over that for right now. But what it did as well, well, they skipped this one, so they skipped this actually pretty important comment I was about to make sure they didn't cover it. Nope, they did not. A pretty important argument that's not listed here in the slides. One of the things the railroads do give us, just besides the fact that we get this rail network being built, the big thing we get is we get a national company that needs a lot of capital, which means you've got a lot of bonds being offered. And this becomes one of the first kind of big investments that's marketed nationally in the United States. And it gets, it starts to build up the capital markets in the United States. And the person that makes the most money in the selling of these bonds would be, well, and the one side would be the Europeans. The Europeans, by the turn of the 20th century, own about 20% of the railroads in the United States, which becomes a little bit concerning about how much foreign ownership there is of the U.S. railroads. But the other part of it would be is that the railroads make James Pierpont Morgan one of the richest people in the United States. And he's a financier that basically collects all the capital that's needed by the railroads. And so we get sort of the emergence of the incredibly rich in the United States. The other thing that we start to see here is that the government, as we're building up this national system, we also have to build into this that the government's going to get more involved in terms of regulation. And where they get involved in regulation is with the discriminatory pricing that the railroads are using. The idea here was that while in some markets they had more competition, right? This would be like longer haul travel, let's say from the East Coast to Chicago. There might be several railroads all competing for the same amount of freight. But the problem would be is that you've got spur lines, lines that a single railroad has to a smaller community off of the main line. And what the railroads were doing is that on the short haul routes on that spur, they would charge really, really high prices because they were the only railroad to be offering it. And basically, the farmers got really upset with that because they felt forced to use these spur lines where the prices were really high, whereas the manufacturers could use these long haul lines and get much cheaper, and get just much cheaper prices. What this did is it gave us the Interstate Commerce Act. And in the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, you had more active involvement of the federal government in the setting of prices and in the general power of the railroads to determine those prices. Obviously, the government's not happy about that, or sorry, the railroads aren't happy about that. But it is needed to be able to kind of curtail the the power of big business over the farmers. The states do get involved as well, not as much as the federal government, but in the states where the railroads are most important to the economy, that would be Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, even Minnesota, especially where they have the grangers are incredibly important and where farmers are pretty important, is that those states take a unique stance, a stronger stance in regulating the railroads at the state level. But we have a pretty important no, it's not even here. But even though the states are taking more of an active role, there becomes a pretty important Supreme Court case in 1886, which stops the states from curtailing interstate commerce, because that's a right to that the Constitution gives to the federal government. So what ends up happening is that since most of the rail travel is going to go between states, that means that most of the regulation, we realize that by 1886, that the regulation has to come from the federal government, from the national government, or there would be no regulation at all. The Interstate Commerce Act, again, the one that's signed in 1887, what it did is it gave, again, this Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Interstate Commerce Commission it determines the way in which prices are determined. It determines the way in which the railroads in general operate, and it becomes, for the most part, one of the first meaningful ways in which the federal government is going to intervene in the economy. The Interstate Commerce Commission was really designed to, again, to protect the farmers. It was designed to protect consumers. It wasn't designed to help the railroads. Rather, it was made to curtail the railroads. But what happens over time is regulatory capture. And this is what you see with monopolies or even oligopolies. To remind ourselves what that is. Regulatory capture occurs when you've got something being regulated by the government, some company being regulated by the government. So then the company spends a lot of money to basically lobby the regulators to get the kinds of laws that they want, right? In some sense, then the regulators are captured or controlled by the company that they regulate. It happens all the time, right? I mean, the clearest example we have here in the state of Hawaii is that the largest lobbyist in Hawaii is Hawaiian Electric, with most of that money going to the agency that regulates their activities, the Public Utility Commission. We see the same thing here. Research that's done in the 20th century about the Interstate Commerce Commission and the actions of the railroad shows that between 1886 and the 1920s, that there was a fair amount of lobbying done by the railroads to try to control the regulators. It might not have happened to the same extent to which we see it today, but there still was a fair amount. Okay, the final things that we see here for this chapter was that, if we were taking this class maybe even 30 years ago or 40 years ago, there wouldn't be just one chapter about the railroads. The whole idea would be is that everything changed dramatically with the building of the railroad and that it fundamentally shifted the way that the economy was growing. And that's not really what most economic historians believe today. Rather that the railroads were incredibly useful in this growing nationalization of the economy, that they were a consequence of the consolidation that we're going to see in the next chapter of the banking system, that they are a net result of the fact that you've got grains and extractive things being done on the frontier and industry being done on the East Coast. So you do need this transportation system. But that also, though, what you see is that if we didn't have the railroads, we still would have been able to move things, just would have been slower. I mean, it was still cheaper to move things by water, right? And so instead of doing the railroads, we could have just built up the canal system more. We could have just increased the river travel more. And that could have been a transition to get us to when we would have trucks and automobiles and even later railroads. I mean, railroads are more expensive than the building of the canals. So in essence, we could create these alternative histories of the United States and where we didn't have railroads. And the general belief today among US economic historians is that it wouldn't look that different. It'd be a little bit less efficient, and you'd have a little bit less productivity, and you'd have a slightly smaller GDP in the United States. But you'd still largely have the same United States that we see today. It's just that the railroads would have been developed later when we had more capital existing in the system. These kinds of alternative histories are interesting to think about and to consider, but at the same time, um, they do kind of highlight how, um, while you're living that time period, for instance, we could see our world where we would think we can't live without the internet or something like that. But yet, at the same time, we probably would have done things differently. And yes, it'd be a little bit less productive. But if we think about the scale of the investment that was required to build out the internet to the extent that we have it, some alternatives might have been just as good. Um, okay, that really ends this chapter here.